When the new Tesla Model 3 was announced, there was the rear-wheel drive and the all-wheel drive models only, with the performance model being omitted altogether. And I thought to myself, that actually made sense because the all-wheel drive model was plenty fast, and the manufacturer also sold the Model S and the Model S Plaid. Granted, they come in at a different price points, but boy was I wrong. We now have the Model 3 Performance, which at the time of filming and in the UK costs £60,000. That is a £10,000 premium over the all-wheel drive model, and that in itself is also a £10,000 premium over the entry-level Tesla Model 3 rear-wheel drive, which starts from £40,000. So in this review, you're going to see if the Model 3 Performance is actually worth its price tag, and of course how it compares to some of its key competitors. Now, to kick things off, we have to talk about its absolutely ridiculous performance. And yes, there's even an insane setting that you can select via the infotainment system. Now, here the manufacturer shared that you've got 460 horsepower that is dispatched from its battery pack and its two electric motors, one that's on the front axle and one that's on the rear. Now, that combines to have an output of 343 kilowatts of power, but unfortunately no sort of torque figures have been shared. Now, using RaceLogic's Performance Box Touch, I had it tested from 0 to 20 miles an hour in just 0.96 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 1.44 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in just 3.19 seconds, and just for context, the all-wheel drive model clocked in at 4.29 seconds, while the entry-level model at 6 seconds, and then the 50 to 70 mile an hour dash in just 1.51 seconds. There's also a peak of 0.96 Gs. So yes, the vehicle will send your head flying back to the headrest. Now, as for its top speed, it'll go all the way up to 163 miles an hour, which is up from 125 miles an hour from its siblings. So aside from its ridiculous straight line performance, what about when it comes to its handling characteristics? Given it is the Model 3 Performance after all, you might be curious as to how it would perform on track. Well, here the vehicle does actually do a pretty good job thanks to the fact that you've got an all-wheel drive system. You can in fact customize it via the track mode and adjust the balance between the front and the rear motor. And yes, you have got that all-wheel drive traction as well, which gives you that extra bit of confidence if you're just simply going to be going around more challenging routes, or of course, for example, on winding country routes. Now, it is also worth mentioning that the overall driver's feel is good, but it's not quite class leading like some of its competitors, namely, for example, from the likes of BMW and Porsche, which somewhat are the best in its class. Here you have still got a somewhat twitchy steering wheel, and you can adjust it on the fly via the infotainment system and therefore stiffening it up a little bit. But in terms of the utmost sense of driver's feel and having that connection with the front axle, well, the Tesla wouldn't be my personal pick. Now, one of the biggest complaints I had about the new Tesla Model 3, or specifically the all-wheel drive model, which was a little bit surprising in comparison to the rear-wheel drive model, was its suspension setup. See, the all-wheel drive model suffered some from low-end resonance, and you could almost hear the dampers constantly resonating each time you're going over challenging scenarios. Whereas that has actually been upgraded in the Model 3 Performance because you've now got adaptive suspension, which is absolutely fantastic. This means you've got adaptive dampers and a suspension that's far more advanced than what you'd find in the regular Model 3 or in the dual motor Model 3. And this means that the vehicle does actually respond a lot better, be it if you're going around winding country routes at speed and putting your foot down, or of course if you're simply going to be pottering around town and going over speed bumps, potholes, and just driving over anomalies, then the vehicle actually soaks them up just that little bit better. Now, make no mistake, it's not exactly the best again in its class and won't compete with more advanced air suspension systems out there like what you'd find in the Model S. But in the grander scheme of things, it's really nice to see that Tesla has addressed the suspension and really upgraded it. In my opinion, that is probably one of the biggest selling points of the Model 3 Performance, just that the suspension is just all that bit better. Now, another area that's been improved is the overall braking performance, and yes, in comparison to the Model 3 all-wheel drive or the entry-level one, it is better. However, I wouldn't quite say that you have got good braking performance. Indeed, over here, if you're going to be coming to an emergency standstill, or of course, if you're going on track, you might still feel that the brake performance is a little bit lackluster, specifically if you compare and contrast it with some of its key competitors. To some degree, I feel that Tesla should have incorporated implemented these brakes on the all-wheel drive or the entry-level Model 3 and then offered you an even beefier setup in the Model 3 Performance. But alas, that's not the case. So past all of this, what about when it comes to the all-important electric range? Well, here supposedly you've got an 82 kilowatt hour battery pack. I say supposedly because the manufacturer has not actually shared the exact capacity. However, based on the previous generation models, it seems to be somewhat accurate. Now, there is a heat pump that comes included as standard, which is certainly appreciated for those colder climate days because it adds to the overall efficiency when it comes to heating the cabin. Now, the manufacturer claims that the Model 3 Performance has got 328 miles, at least according to the WLTP test cycle. Now, from my own mixed driving test, I netted 255 to 275 miles, which in my opinion is actually a pretty respectable figure considering the overall performance that one can attain in the Model 3 Performance. Now, just for some context, the entry-level Tesla Model 3 achieved 225 to 245 miles, while the retested all-wheel drive model netted 310 to 330 miles. Now, for the vehicle to be as efficient as possible and to recoup energy back into the battery pack, there is regenerative braking. And here it's actually done automatically and it's on its harshest mode. In other words, if you were to lift off the accelerator pedal, which I'm just going to do now from 20 miles an hour, the vehicle will come to a complete standstill. And yes, indeed, you have got a one-pedal drive. Now, while I really do like one-pedal drive, I do find it a little bit surprising that Tesla's removed the option via the infotainment system, in other words, for you to adjust it. For example, if you want to disable it or indeed not have a one-pedal drive. You might be wondering, why would you want to ever disable that? Well, simply, for example, if you're on the motorway, it means that you don't have to constantly apply a lot of pressure on the accelerator pedal or else the vehicle will start decelerating. Now, there is, of course, track mode where you can actually adjust the regenerative braking level, but this I don't think is going to be something that most people are going to access regularly when they're just going to be driving on the motorway or indeed just pottering around town. So I do think it's a bit of an oversight from the manufacturer, and considering a lot of its competitors offer you a lot of customization in this department, it is slightly a shame. Now, of course, you do have the ability of plugging it in, and via CCS port, it'll take up to 250 kilowatts of input, and therefore via an appropriate V3 supercharger, it means you can go from 10 to 80% in roughly 25 to 30 minutes. If you connect up to a V2 supercharger, and therefore capped at 150 kilowatts, it'll take you roughly 40 minutes to achieve the same amount of charge. Outside of this, if you go for a 50 kilowatt charger instead, it'll take you roughly 1 to 2 hours. Now, there is an 11 kilowatt onboard charger that comes fitted as standard, and therefore means that if you do have a 3-phase wall box, you can go from 10 to 100% in roughly 8 to 9 hours. If, however, you're going to be relying on a 3-pin input, it'll take you roughly 45 hours. So aside from how it is on the road, the Model 3 Performance differentiates itself from its siblings by including the performance seats and a carbon fiber looking trim that is found on the dashboard. Subtle differences, but ones that are definitely appreciated. I'll be talking about seating comfort very shortly. Now, in terms of the overall interior design, love it or hate it, you've got the minimalist look. It's very much present on pretty much every single Tesla, be it modern or indeed older generation models. However, you will notice that the modern Teslas have also got this interior lighting which wraps all the way around the cabin. It's certainly appreciated as it allows a little bit of customization and personalization. Of course, if you do not want this LED light whatsoever, you can disable it via the infotainment system. Speaking of which, the center-weighted 15.4-inch display is extremely responsive, and it kind of has to be because it gives you all the controls that you'll require. For example, your climate settings, the entertainment that you might want to use, or even the games that you might want to play, and even the navigation system, which is based on Google Maps. It also includes reading the battery state, which means that you can do route planning pretty well directly from the infotainment system and not have to worry about knowing how much charge you'll have at the next sort of charge point. So very clever thinking by Tesla, and indeed for those people who are accustomed to Tesla vehicles in the past, this is exactly what you'd come to expect. Now, in the modern Teslas, including the Model 3 Performance, you have got a drive selector that is done directly from the display. It's towards the driver, of course, and here if you swipe up, you go into drive, swipe down, go into reverse, and you can tap to park. It's actually quite intuitive whilst you get your head around it, so you don't actually miss that function that you'd find on other vehicles, be it via a small little gear selector, or like on the older Teslas where you had a stalk. Now, in case you're wondering if the screen becomes unresponsive or simply is broken, then you've got a manual override that can be found towards the headliner. So that means you can always still drive the car, at least to, for example, a service station before you actually get the screen replaced or indeed fixed. Now, apart from all of that, I would just like to highlight that very much like every single Tesla out there, Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are not supported, which is a bit of a bugbear for myself as someone who's a bit of an audiophile who likes using music that's stored on their smartphone. It means that I can't get high resolution audio playback and instead I have to resort to using Bluetooth, and here the lowest quality SBC codec is supported only. If I'm talking a bit too much jargon here, ultimately what I'm trying to say over here is that Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are not supported. And if you do want higher resolution audio playback, you'll have to plug in via USB or go for a subscription service which costs roughly £10 a month and access the likes of, for example, Tidal or Spotify. Now, if you do actually want a detailed audio breakdown of the sound system that's comprised within the Model 3 all-wheel drive or indeed the Performance, make sure you check it out on your pop-up banner or following the links down in the description below. In a nutshell, the 17-speaker audio system that's comprised within the Model 3 Performance is absolutely stellar across the sound frequency range, and therefore will definitely suffice for even budding audiophiles. Now, another thing that I really do rate is the Tesla app, because you can use your phone as a wireless key and therefore makes it pretty seamless when you're jumping in and out of the vehicle. But you've also got a bunch of different controls that you can access remotely. For example, you can precondition the cabin, you can enable Sentry mode, which allows you to view your live cameras at any given point, and there's a bunch of other settings out there that you can access via the app. It's very intuitive to use and of course free to download for any sort of Tesla owner. Now, despite the Tesla being labelled by some people as a very tech-centric vehicle, it is worth mentioning that there is no head-up display or an instrument cluster, which is quite disappointing. Specifically over here, a head-up display would have been a nice touch by the automaker because it would have added to the overall safety credentials, because you keep your eyes planted on the road and it allows you to check, for example, your traversing speed and the safety systems that are in operation. But alas, that's not the case. As a result, each time you want to check your speedometer or anything else, you'll have to glance towards the center of the display, which means you're taking your eyes further away from the road and looking diagonally to the left if you're on a right-hand drive vehicle, or to the right on a left-hand drive vehicle. Now, what isn't redundant, at least in my opinion, are the removal of the stalks. Now, by that I mean I would have really liked to see traditional stalks still included in the new Model 3, but that's not the case, and indeed over here everything is done via touch-sensitive buttons that are found via the steering wheel. Now, some people will quickly get used to it, and of course you do get used to the positioning of the indicator buttons and, for example, the windscreen wiper or, for example, the headlight flashing, but here it does mean that if you're going around a roundabout, at least in Europe, you will find yourself a little bit of an awkward situation because you've indicated, for example, right towards a roundabout, and when you want to exit the roundabout, you're tapping a left button. You have to find the button somewhere around the steering wheel, and to me it absolutely drives me insane. Every single time I've driven any of the new Teslas, it's something that I've just found a bit too polarizing, and indeed it might be a bit too much for certain individuals. I think it's a bit of a step too far. Further, I should also talk about the overall longevity of these buttons. As someone who does work in the tech industry as well, I can say that haptic buttons or capacitive buttons, when they're pressed for a long period of time, will slowly degrade. And if you think of the lifespan of a vehicle, it does actually raise some concerns. And I'm actually not talking completely out of thin air over here, because if you do look online, you'll find some Model S owners who've already mentioned that their indicator buttons are becoming somewhat unresponsive, and that to me does cause a bit of concern. But nonetheless, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below. Now, the removal of those stalks is certainly cumbersome in my opinion, but it does open up the cabin and make it feel a bit more spacious. And yes, indeed, there's plenty of storage compartments. First off, you've got the magnetic glove box, which can be operated and even set a pin via the infotainment system. You then have got two wireless charging pads at the front of the center console. Then further down, you've got a small little retractable area, which reveals a nice large area that's been lined in fabric and a 12-volt socket. Further down, you've then got another retractable area with two cup holders, and then underneath the center armrest, you've got an even larger area where there's also a singular USB Type-C port for charging. There's also a further two USB Type-C ports at the rear of the center console for your rear occupants. Now, as for the door bins, the front two are large enough to accommodate a 500ml bottle alongside some small to medium-sized valuables, while the rear two are a little bit more limited. It's nice, however, to see that all of the door bins have been lined in fabric, which means that any sort of loose change or keys won't be heard rattling about when you are traversing uneven terrain. Now, the rear of the cabin, there's also a pull-down armrest compartment, which is actually pretty elongated, and you've also got two cup holders. Now, as for its boot, you've got 594 litres to play around with, which is bigger than its predecessors and larger than some of its key competitors. It's estimated that you'll get roughly 1,300 to 1,400 litres when you drop down the seats, although there's no official figure that's been shared by the manufacturer. Now, you have also got a 60/40 rear split folding design with a flat loading bay and also a huge underfloor compartment, which is certainly appreciated. Better still, you've also got an 88 litre frunk capacity, in other words, an area that is found underneath the front bonnet. Now, it's worth mentioning, however, that the front compartment is only electronically released, however, it has to be manually closed. However, the tailgate is electronically operated, be it via the app, via the infotainment system, or by pressing a button that is found at the back of the vehicle. Now, it is worth mentioning over here that unlike some of the alternatives out there, the Tesla Model 3 does not have that hatchback design, rather that sort of saloon hatch opening. And there's also no integrated ski latch, so it's just some food for thought in case you are regularly taking elongated goods. Now, past its storage capabilities, what about when it comes to seating comfort? Well, here you have got those performance seats, which are a little bit stiffer in comparison to the ones that you'd find on the regular Model 3 or, of course, the all-wheel drive Model 3, and therefore might be a little bit more uncomfortable on those longer drives. Nonetheless, I didn't have too much issues on my tests, and furthermore, I really did appreciate that the performance seats felt a little bit more snug, at least in my opinion, therefore meaning that when you're going around winding country routes, you don't seem to be going off the seat a little bit in comparison to what you'd find on the regular Model 3. Now, it is also good to see that the front seats are electronically operated, ventilated, and also heated, and the steering wheel is also heated as standard too. Now, as for the rear seats, they are also heated, which is fantastic to see, although it's worth mentioning that the rear middle seat is no longer heated like you'd find on the previous generation model. Now, the seating comfort at the back of the cabin is also pretty good. While the seats themselves are a little bit wedged in and therefore diagonally shaped and might be a little bit uncomfortable on your quad muscles, it is still very comfortable for someone who is just under 6 foot. Headroom is not too bad and legroom is absolutely excellent, specifically over here given that the floor has been optimized because there is no sort of transmission tunnel like you'd find on some rival alternatives. Now, speaking of which, it's fantastic to see that you have got an 8-inch touchscreen display at the back of the cabin. And indeed, this can be often seen as a bit of an extra in more premium alternatives, whereas this is fitted as standard in the Tesla Model 3. And this means that you have got media controls and also climate controls that are visually seen via this small little display. Equally, I absolutely love the fact that you have got this panoramic glass roof, and yes, you have got a beam between the first and second row, but truthfully over here I really do love its inclusion because it stretches all the way back and therefore allows both the front and rear occupants to really enjoy the scenery around them. In case you're wondering, it is also UV protected, so you don't have to worry about getting any sort of sunburn or any sort of suntan while you're sat inside the vehicle. Now, another thing that's a trait of Tesla vehicles is a pressure sensor that's found in the front seat, which makes it very handy for getting in and out of the vehicle quite quickly. However, it is worth mentioning that even if you have someone that's sat within the cabin and you were to step out as the driver, the vehicle will power down. Thankfully, unlike some alternatives out there, you can simply tap on the front or rear infotainment system and therefore initiate the climate controls or indeed media playback, making it actually pretty intuitive. On that note, the doors have an electronic release. There's a button that can be found on any of the 4 doors, and by simply pressing it, it releases the door, allows you to get out pretty easily. There's also a manual release in case you are wondering in an emergency situation, so you don't have to ever worry about if it ever fails. Now, it's very intuitive to get out, however, getting into the vehicle does require a slight technique. You do get your head around it pretty quickly, but it's just worth mentioning that if you were to pick up someone and they've never come across a Tesla before, then it might be a little bit weird for them actually getting into the vehicle for the very first time. Now, another thing that sets itself aside from other vehicles out there on the market is its exterior design. I'll be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below, but subjectively, I really do love what Tesla have achieved over here, specifically with the Model 3 Performance, which has got a slightly bit of that extra sportier and aggressive stance on the road. This is due to the fact that the manufacturer has adjusted the front bumper and splitter design, the diffuser, added a spoiler, and of course those 20-inch forged wheels, which really do complete the look. In my opinion, it's the best Model 3 that Tesla has ever produced, at least when it comes to the overall exterior design. Now, furthermore, it's also very safe. Now, while it hasn't been tested by Euro NCAP, at least not the recent model, the previous generation one scored 5 out of 5 stars, scoring a whopping 96% in adult occupancy, 86% in child occupancy, and 94% in its safety assist scores. Now, when it comes to the driver assistance systems, as standard, you have got a whole bunch of them that come included as standard. Here you have got lane departure warning, emergency lane departure avoidance, automatic blind spot monitoring via small little LEDs that are found towards the mirror triangles, and also a camera system which integrates directly via the infotainment system each time, for example, you indicate, or of course, if you have not checked your blind spot, which I do think is fantastic inclusion by the manufacturer. You've got forward collision warning, automatic emergency braking system, speed limit assist, driver drowsy warning, traffic aware cruise control, which actually does a fantastic job of keeping you at a safe distance from the leading vehicle, and it doesn't feel jerky either. And it also has got stop and go technology, and you've also got auto steer, which provides you steering support on the motorway, which also does a tremendous job. Remember, all of these come included as standard, which isn't the same that can be said about the vast majority of its competitors. Now, if you do want to go a step further, you can go for the enhanced autopilot pack, which will set you back £3,400, and this gives you lane changing and also takes exits on motorways on auto steer. Useful inclusions, but in my opinion, not really worth the overall asking price. The same could be said about the full self-driving package at £6,800, which at the time only gives you traffic light and stop sign control, among a few small other features, which in my opinion are pretty redundant in Europe or indeed the UK. But of course, you might disagree or indeed want to be at the forefront of any sort of self-driving technology. So in this respect, if that's the case, then you might want to opt for the FSD package. On the subject of being at the forefront of technological advancements in the automotive industry, you have got Tesla Vision, which comes included as standard. Now, this effectively is a camera-based system for your surroundings. And yes, it does away with the ultrasonic sensors like you might have come to expect on pretty much every single vehicle that's been produced on the market. Now, Tesla Vision has its pros and cons. I like the fact that it's being constantly updated. It gives you a really detailed view of your surroundings, but sometimes is a little bit hit and miss when it comes to, let's say, going and reversing or going in front of vegetation, where the vehicle will think that it's a solid object. Ultrasonic sensors seem to be smart enough to realize that is not the case, at least from my own experience. So here I would have wished that Tesla had incorporated both ultrasonic sensors and Tesla Vision in order to give you the best sort of package, but that is not the case. Now, nonetheless, over here, visibility at the front and side are excellent, and you've also got a camera-based system which gives you extra peace of mind, which is very handy because rear view visibility is a little bit limited due to the sloping roofline of the Model 3. Now, you have also got an 11.7 meter turning circle, which makes it very easy to maneuver the vehicle in a tight parking space. So with all that in mind, it brings us on to our verdict. And here, what Tesla have achieved with the Model 3 Performance is absolutely extraordinary. You're getting ridiculous straight line performance, which will compete with some supercars and even hypercars to a certain extent. You're getting a pretty comfortable driving experience thanks to its adaptive suspension. And you're also getting a really nice exterior design that one-ups its siblings. At least in my opinion, it just looks a little bit sportier. Now, with that said, it's still actually a really complete vehicle. It's got good electric range, it's got plenty of technology within the cabin, it's really safe with plenty of driver assistance systems, it's comfortable to be sat at the front or rear of the cabin, and you've got plenty of space with the boot and also even the frunk. All these considered, and its overall price tag means that the Model 3 Performance can certainly be recommended, and as such, it gets our Best Buy awards. Now, do consider, however, there are some alternatives that you might want to look at from the likes of BYD, BMW, Polestar, among a few others, and ones that we would actually suggest you to look at will be down in the description below. Now, we'd be curious to know which vehicle you would pick, be it in terms of the Model 3 lineup or, of course, alternatives at roughly £60,000 down in the comment section below. Now, if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I'll hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.